I'm very drawn to Great Lakes maritime history, and our area has a ton of it. Not that you would know some of it now. The shipbuilding industry, shipbuilding repair, ancillary services like ironworks and sail making and that sort of thing, employed between 1,000 and 2,000 people from kind of the early to mid 19th century right on up into the early to mid 20th century. And so it's hard to believe because there's none of that left. And again, we're talking today not about recreational boats, but rather we're talking about commercial shipping, ships that would haul goods and goods to various ports. So once again, I apologize for sitting, but it's easier to look at my cheat sheet and also to operate this thing. And I also, about the last 10 years, need glasses. Yeah, like a lot of people, yeah. Okay, so shipbuilding was a very big employer in Port Huron for about 100 years. And during that period, shipbuilding itself, we had probably almost 200 commercial ships built in the city of Port Huron. And then, of course, they sailed the waters of the lakes. This way. The first of those vessels was the sloop Temperance, built in 1838 in Port Huron. And for its day, it was about a 30-ton schooner. And for its day, it was kind of an average ship. That was the size of commercial vessels in that day. Over the next 15 years, there were 27 more vessels built in Port Huron, with 6 in 1848 and 7 in 1853. Part of the reason why there was so much shipbuilding in Port Huron, and I should point out to you that there was a lot of shipbuilding all throughout St. Clair County, with the community where most ships were built is actually Marine City. But we had second most and probably more ancillary activities in Port Huron than Marine City did. But in any event, part of the reason for this, all this shipbuilding activity, was that the preferred material for vessels back in the early days was white oak for the hull and fir or pine trees, so to speak, for the masts and the decks. And we in Port Huron and all of St. Clair County happen to be located along an east-west line that runs all through Wisconsin and into Michigan and right on in through Ontario, north of which the dominant forest tree is conifer, which means pine or some type of a needled tree. And the dominant tree to the south of the line is deciduous, trees that lose their leaves, such as maple and white oak. So we had a plentiful amount of both types of wood nearby. And again, that can be said for all the communities in St. Clair County, as well as other places too. This particular shot here shows some of the lumber coming down the Black River. And this fella here is, let's see if this works. Oh yeah, this guy standing on the bridge. This is the 7th Street Bridge, and in the background is the John Beard lumber mill. But as you know, lumbering was a very, very big business in Port Huron as well. Well, during this time, Port Huron, of course, was an expanding city, but they continued to build more and more vessels. And some of the reason for that is, of course, the growth in development in the United States, and particularly in the Midwest, and the need to ship more goods back and forth from where they were manufactured or grown to where they were consumed. as well as the massive number of vessel losses. Some of you may know that there are estimated to be 10,000 shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. And every year there was probably for all of most all of the 19th century and into really the first half of the 20th century, there was upwards of 100 vessels lost every year. Now some of them were driven ashore, but typically during a storm they'd be pounded to pieces. Sometimes they were driven high ashore and were able to be salvaged, but many times they were not. Many of them, of course, in the days of wooden ships and iron men, many of these wooden ships would burn profusely, so that was a cause for vessel loss, as well as was collision and simple foundering, where the ship is overcome by the waves and sinks in mid-lake. So these vessels needed to be replaced, as well as the merchant fleet needed to grow. So that was one of the reasons why shipbuilding, there were so many ships built over the years. Another thing is wooden ships lasted probably on average about 20 years. Now some lasted much longer, and some of course were wrecked or lost much earlier than that. But just the nature of the fact that it was a wooden vessel and it was in commercial use. Well, shipbuilding was a lot different in the early days. So certainly when the early ships were built in Port Huron, in those days, the shipbuilder, the shipwright, as well as the ship's carpenter and other skilled builders would come to the customer. And that customer might be a group of wealthy businessmen, merchants, or it might be a group of wealthy farmers. And they decided they were going to operate a ship, in many cases, to ship their own produce or their own manufactured goods out. And so the shipbuilder would come to the customer, and they would stroll through the local forests and pick out many of the ship's timbers from living trees. Here's another example, the stern post with if the picture went on further, when I converted these slides to PowerPoint, some things got lost in the process. Anyway, the ship's crutch would just be another ship part that was above that. This is an example of a piece of wood chosen because it would be easy to build a ship's knee. Now, many of you are unfamiliar with ship's knees, but I'll show you in some pictures how prevalent they are and how many they needed on a wooden ship. So the first step would be that these merchants or farmers would pick out a piece of land. They might buy it or rent it along the water, and they would erect keel blocks. So the land would be cleared, and then they would erect these keel blocks, and on top of the keel blocks, they would lay a keel plate. Now, in the early days, the builders would kind of had the plans for the ship in their head, more or less. And in later days, of course, they developed, drawings for the vessels. Here, this is a small three-masted schooner. Or here's a little bigger schooner, and you can see in this picture the ribs that extend from this all the way to the side of the ship and all through the turn of the chine. And then this, of course, is the cargo deck. This is a half look. So this is the keel. There's the keel plate on the bottom, and then the ribs, and then this is the big keel. The main keel runs the length of the ship. And so in the early days, they didn't even use plans. Once again, the shipwright would be in overall charge, but the various skilled people, the ship's carpenters and so forth, would be on site, and that's what they would cut and mill the lumber right there. And of course, as the ship rose, first with the ribs, typically on wooden ships on the Great Lakes, the ribs were on 1-foot centers, so they were pretty close, as you can see. The lumber, as I say, was milled right on site. They didn't take it to a lumber mill, and they didn't have mechanical saws and the like. So some of the equipment that the ship's carpenter would use would be like the cross-cut saw, the ship axe, as well as something, and I don't know the pronunciation of this, but I believe it's adze, A-D-Z-E. Adze, thank you. And it's a tool for doing the finer work with the wood. So those are the kinds of tools that were used at the site of the ship as it was being built. Here's some of those ship's knees that you see. There's some here at the center. This is the upper deck, and you see some more knees here. So once the ribs were in place and the keel and the keel blocks laid, then the ship was planked over, both on the outside and on the inside. And again, all of the material used in this was white oak. Once the hull was completed and planked over on both sides, then the masts were set and the deck was put on, and the ship was ready for the rigging. Now, the rigging on a ship was actually as expensive typically as the hull on a sailing ship. The rigging, of course, included things like the ship's helm or steering wheel. Also, it included capstans for hoisting sails, windlasses for hoisting up the anchor. It also included both standing rigging and running rigging. Standing rigging would be those lines that went up to the mast. You see them on both sides and attached to the side of the ship, and they would be used to adjust the mast so it would be straight. You could loosen up on one side, tighten up on the other side to adjust the mast. That was called the standing rigging. And then the running rigging was all the rope and the block and tackle that was used to hoist the sails. So by the 1860s, Port Huron, obviously, as you can see from this little map, I think these are so great. There was a company that used to do this for cities, and long before they had airplanes or a way to, but they would just, the artist could imagine what it would look like from above. Anyhow, here you can see this is the Black River. And there, I think, is the Military Street Bridge. And this is the St. Clair River out here. Well, during the 1860s, there were 54 vessels built in Port Huron. And with the greater part of that being built after the end of the Civil War. Also by the 1860s, shipbuilding had changed. Rather than the shipwright and the ship's carpenter coming to the customer, they began to settle down and open shipyards where the customer would come to them and then order the ships be built. So during the 1860s, as I say, 54 vessels were built. Some of the better known shipbuilders in the area in the 1860s were Lorenzo Bedford. He built 13 vessels. Ernest Fitzgerald built 6. Thomas Dunford built 3. Archibald Muir built 3. So those were the names associated, or some of them, with shipbuilding. This little shot of Chicago Harbor speaks a lot toward the dominant type of merchant vessel at this time, by the late 1860s, and that was, of course, the 2, 3, sometimes 4-masted schooner. We did have one 5-masted schooner built on Lake Michigan, the David Dow's, but most of them were 2- and 3-masted schooners. And of course, by today's standards, they'd be very tiny, but in the day, that was the size that ships were. And each year, the ships got bigger, pretty much. Another vessel on the ways here. This is Sarnia Harbor, and once again you see all the schooners at anchor. You do see a tug here, a steamer, and a passenger steamer, but all the rest of these freighters, so to speak, on the Great Lakes were sailing vessels. To give you an idea of the number of sailing vessels and vessels of all types that were on the Great Lakes in the back of the 19th century, the later 19th century, each year when the vessels would fit out after the ice began to come out, there would be between 1,000 and 2,000 vessels fit out. Compare that to today's Great Lakes fleet. The combined Canadian and U.S. fleet probably numbers about 130. So obviously these were not nearly as big as the vessels today. Can you imagine how many of these vessels it would take to fill up a 1,000-footer? Sailing vessels, of course, in real favorable weather could sail up most of the St. Clair River if the wind was to the south or to the east or west and blowing hard. But they usually could not get through the so-called rapids, where just south of where the bridge is. And of course there was no bridge then, but that area of the rapids, they had to be towed typically either by a tug or a passing steamer might, they might pay a passing steamer to tow them up into the lake. Then they'd let them go. By the end of the 1860s, maybe into the 1870s, the preferred type of sailing vessel on the Great Lakes was the topsail schooner. You see a two-masted topsail schooner here. And again, most of them were 2- and 3-masted, a few 4-masted schooners. But this kind of evolved because when they first started building commercial ships on the Great Lakes, they built square riggers, they built barkentines, which are mostly square rigged. They built barks, which had 4-mast square rigged. So they experimented with all these various types until this seemed to evolve as the best at tacking, the best at maneuvering in the tight quarters, and also requiring relatively minimum number of crew to operate. So as time went on, this was the dominant type of sailing vessel that you saw. I had mentioned to you that shipbuilders, and of course they all engaged in repair as well, but shipbuilders had settled down, and the shipyards, some of the famous names from our area include Dunford and Alverson Shipyard and Dry Dock. And Dunford and Alverson, oops, how'd that happen? Ooh. Okay, the Dunford and Alverson Dry Dock, you can see here, this is the Black River, this is the St. Clair River, so this would be north of Black River, and kind of behind the, where the, today the yacht club is. And this is the Dunford and Alverson Dry Dock. And so vessels would be pushed in by tugs, and once they got into the dry dock, this gate would be lowered, and actually the gates typically floated. Now I got some better pictures later to show you how that worked, but they, oh, there it is. So you kind of see where the dry dock was. Later, Dunford and Alverson moved their operation further south. There's Military Street, and they were about 2.5 miles south of the post office. And they cut a dry dock into the land that was kind of had an angular approach to it. There's a steamer and a tug that are in Dunford and Alverson Dry Dock.
Did they later fill those in?
Yep.
Where Sears used to be, telephone company?
Yeah, that's where, yep, there were a couple of them there. The second Dunford and Alverson Dry Dock was, well, I'll get to another one. but to give you an idea. But yeah, they filled them in, and there's really no sign of them today. Another one was Dry Dock and Iron Works by the Fitzgerald brothers. And Dry Dock, their Dry Dock, you see here their ship is being built or repaired. I'm not sure which, but. Another one was Port Huron Dry Dock, run by the Reed Wrecking Company. And there's a vessel in Reed's Port Huron Dry Dock. That one is down, I believe, down by, trying to think of the cross street. You seem to know where it is too. You can still see the opening where the dry dock was cut into the land.
It was not too far from his house.
No, much further down. Yes. I think it's Reed Street, the name, and that's the cross street, Reed Street. So Reed Street, runs into where Reed Street would run into the water if it did, but it was off Military. As well as the Wolverine Dry Dock. And Wolverine Dry Dock, like Dunford-Alverson, they really had two different locations. They originally were located up north of Black River, and they had a floating dry dock. So actually they used the hull of the old, they used to have something in Port Huron to transport rail cars back and forth. Grand Trunk had a swing ferry, which didn't have any propulsion. It simply used the current in its rudders to scoot over to Sarnia and then to scoot back to Port Huron on a big long cable. And that swing ferry, the Huron, was later converted into the first Wolverine Dry Dock. So they simply, cleared out the deck and the rails and so forth, and they cut the back off, and a ship would sail into the dry dock, and then they would put the stern gate back in, and they would pump the water out, and the Huron would rise up with the ship kind of in there as its cargo, so to speak. And that's how floating. Go ahead. Yeah, it is. That's how floating dry docks work. But then Wolverine Dry Dock, and it had numerous owners, but it was moved down to the St. Clair River. Wolverine Dry Dock was moved down to the St. Clair River, and they bought another hull. And the final location was just north of the Bean Dock or the Port Huron Terminal. You can even see some of it still in the water, or you could. And they bought the Fred Pabst, and the Pabst, they did the same thing with it. They took the stern off, and they'd sink it, and a little bit of it, stuck above water. A vessel would sail in, or be pushed in, more likely by tugs, and they would float the stern gate, flood the stern gate, and it would sink. And then they would pump the water out of the whole thing, and it would rise up and have the vessel in it.
Now, who did that? Was that Reed?
That was Wolverine Dry Dock. Yeah, Wolverine. Yeah, Reed's Dry Dock was a permanent cut in the land, as was Dunford-Alverson's too. Yep. Yes, it is. That's exactly right where it was. And the Wolverine Dry Dock was located, as I say, just north of the Port Huron Terminal. And it's hard to see in this picture. Obviously, there's a lot of buildings and stuff in the way, but these arch trusses here, these are on the side of the Pabst, and the schooner that's in here, this is inside the hull of the Pabst, and it's raised up. So they would be working on the schooner. During the 1880s, there were 12 vessels built in Port Huron, including one that a lot of people knew years ago, the Omar Conger. The Omar Conger was a wooden passenger ferry that would cart people from its dock on the Black River across to Sarnia, and then from Sarnia back over to Port Huron, passenger and light freight. This was, of course, in the days before the first span of the Blue Water Bridge was built. So that's how they would. There were other ferries as well, but the Conger was a pretty famous one, well known in Port Huron. Another vessel built in 1885 was was the Homer Alverson, and it was built by Dunford in Alverson. I should tell you that George Hardson built the Omar Conger.
Oh, is that the one that caught fire at the dock and exploded?
It didn't catch fire. It just exploded. The boiler blew on it. We'll talk about that later. This is the Omar. I mean, not the Omar Conger. This is the Homer. Let me find where I am here. This is the Homer Alverson, 1885. So it's a big schooner, big three-master. And you see all the people aboard. When these ships were launched, it was a big deal in Port Huron. You know, the bands would play, and usually the schools would close for that day, and big crowd of people, because they would side launch these ships. So they would slide down the ways and slide into the Black River or the St. Clair River, and big splash, of course. But it was a big deal. And so the Homer Alverson sits here just before launch, probably. So a total of 12 vessels were built during the 1880s, including these two. Not only do we have, of course, the shipbuilders and the repair facilities, but we had ancillary services like the Phoenix Iron Works was a kind of a famous iron works located in Port Huron. And it was one of a number, but they built the engines as ships were transitioning to steam power. They built the engines, and they built some deck machinery for the schooners as well. The Phoenix Iron Works had two facilities. They were both on 4th Street, on both sides of Court. One was on Wall Street and 4th, and the other was on Union and 4th, that were iron. By the 1890s, during the 1890s, we had 16 vessels built in Port Huron, including the steamer C.O. Carpenter, which we see here. And the Carpenter was built by the Jenks shipyard. And of course, repairs continue to be big business. This is a guy working in a shipyard, probably a dry dock, and he's caulking. He has a caulking hammer, or a mallet. It's really a wood mallet, and he's using it with a caulking iron, and he's putting oakum up in the seams of this vessel. And that was just part of the ship repair and maintenance that had to be done. But things were changing in shipbuilding. The new preferred material for commercial ships was becoming steel. And vessel owners wanted their ships made from steel. It took a while before that was accepted, because a lot of people didn't think a steel ship could even float. But once it was determined that it could, and it, could do well in a storm and so forth, pretty soon the vessel owners wanted steel ships. Only one of our shipyards in Port Huron made the transition to steel ships, and that is the Jenks shipyard. And the Jenks yard, this is a site of where it was first located, just north of the 7th Street Bridge, kind of where the community college is now. And then in the mid to late 1890s, Jenks moved his operation further up the Black River, kind of to 16th Street or 17th Street, where that rail bridge still is. So he moved his operation up there. And the Jenks Shipbuilding Company, it's interesting because this was definitely a family business. W.S. Jenks, S.G. Jenks, W.G. Jenks, and they don't even show the originator of the company, which was Orrin Jenks. And then how did A.M. Carpenter get in there? I don't know.
And one of those guys was also listed as part of the owners of the Phoenix.
That's right. That's right. Big family, big name in shipbuilding. We do at the museum have a model somewhere of the Jenks shipyard. I think the last iteration of it. And that was commissioned, I believe, by the Jenks family. I think they live in California now.
So would that be
Yes, exactly, right where the Chicory building that just burned was, and Atchison Coal Lights is still up there. The original Jenks shipyard was here. It was, and notice the name Carpenter. That was he had a lumber mill, and these are delightful maps. These are insurance maps that are available at the county library, and they show. And then all of these things too will have ratings on them, fire ratings. So they're fire insurance maps, but they help in showing where businesses were. This is Erie Street, and River Street doesn't go back here anymore, but there's Broad Street, and the bridge, the 7th Street Bridge would be here. So it gives you an idea where the original Jenks shipyard was, and then when they moved it upriver, this is that actual photograph of the shipyard, although it's hard to tell because there's so many other businesses in the photo. And somebody, I don't remember where I got this, but you know, Atchison Coal Lights, and so you kind of know where it is. And the Chicory is here somewhere too.
The Chicory would have been to the right there.
Oh,
correct?
okay,
Based on where Atchison Coal Lights is showing.
Yep.
I would think it would be kind of where the greenness is just above that.
Yeah, it's
It's hard to say.
a little confusing. This is the map of the new Jenks shipyard, and this is Black River. Of course, the shipyard had to be adjacent to the river, and Jenks didn't have a dry dock.
Yeah, it sounds sketchy.
Yeah, wouldn't be surprised.
It's been there a long time.
But it looks like they were on Kearney Street. I'm not sure what this street is, but I know it's near where the railroad bridge goes across by 17th. Yes, yeah, just before you get would be east of Port Huron paper. In the 1890s, the Jenks built in 1896 he built the Captain Thomas Wilson, and was built up by 16th Street. He also built and launched the Ravens Craig in 1900. These were steel ships.
So the Black River had to have been deeper than it is now.
Well, technically the Black River is still, according to the Army Corps of Engineers, it's navigable up to, there's a turnaround would be just west of the freeway. You know where the freeway crosses? So just west of that, there was a turning basin, so the ships would turn around. So that's as far up as they would navigate.
Will the tugs still get in there to break the ice?
Yes, they do. Yep, they do. The John B. Cole and the Kanawha were built in 1902 by Jenks. And 1901, why I got these reversed, I don't know, but when it's on PowerPoint, it's hard to change, yeah. So there was 1 year apart. They built the Henry Steinbrenner. Was built in a 420-foot long steel vessel. In 1913, the Eastland and then the F.B. Squire were built. And the Eastland, unlike most of the others, was not a bulk carrier, not a freight carrier. It was a passenger boat. And the Eastland was built by Jenks up at his shipyard. Of course, it was a steel ship.
And would this have been when Military Street Bridge was still a turning?
Yes, thank you. Great introduction for me. You'll see in just a second. This is the front of the Eastland, the bow of it. You can see what a slim ship it was. But again, it was a passenger ship and made to be fairly fast. Here's the stern of it, and as you can see, its home port would be Michigan City, Indiana. So it primarily, when it was delivered, here it is in operation, it was a day boat. So it would take passengers, but there were no staterooms, or they wouldn't not spend the night on the Eastland. But the Eastland operated on southern Lake Michigan and was a very popular excursion boat. Here's a picture of the swing bridge he's talking about. And look at how tight the fit is. You know, we have drawbridges, of course, and we still have the 3 drawbridges. But back at this time, in the early 20th century, they were called swing bridges. And so when they were closed and traffic was going across them, they would be perpendicular to the river, and they would connect the street on either side. But when a boat needed to pass, they would turn so they were perpendicular to the river, and the boat could pass on either side. And likely one side was slightly bigger than the other, but they were approximately the same. And this is the Captain Thomas Wilson, a 420-footer that Jenks built, just squeezing through. And you can see that the bridge has a passenger, where pedestrians can walk across. Well, they had the same thing on the other side. But to get this ship through, they had to actually take that off so the ship could sneak through. And really, this kind of spelled the demise of the Jenks shipyard, the Jenks Shipbuilding Company. They'd screwed up when they, instead of locating on the St. Clair River, they located further up the Black River. All their vessels had to, once they were finished, had to get through these 3 bridges.
And build all those with the bow to the east, or you wouldn't be able to get them turned around.
Yeah. So the kind of spelled the demise of the Jenks. There was talk, and there was an attempt made by Jenks to purchase some property on the St. Clair River and move his operation there after 1903. But the founder of the company, Orrin Jenks, passed away, and the project was never completed. And there may have been other problems too. So the Jenks shipyard was the Yeager Bridge Company for a long time, took over the facilities, and of course it ceased. So really, the vessels built in 1903, the Squire being the last one, was the last commercial vessel built in Port Huron. But there's more to shipbuilding. There was tremendous amount of repair activity. Most ships in 1903 sailing the lakes were still wooden vessels, and they needed a lot of work, particularly as they got older. The various dry docks continued to operate right on up through World War I. Here is a barge that has been cut in 2 intentionally, and a bulkhead has been put in the dry dock, and they were being prepared to be towed through, out of the Great Lakes, through the Welland Canal, and then through the locks on the St. Lawrence River out to the East Coast to join the war effort, World War I. And the locks were smaller in those days. So the dry docks continued to be used for activities like that, as well as the maintenance and repair. Here's a schooner out of Detroit. This is about 1919. It's a schooner. Here it is in one of the Port Huron dry docks. And as you can tell, the dry docks are starting to look a little raggedy. But they've been in use for a while. This gives you an idea. Here, this little contraption you see here is the back gate. And so the schooner would be eased into the dry dock, and then this gate, which could be pumped out and float, or it could be scuttled so it would sink to the bottom. So this then would be pulled over and put in place and then scuttled. So it would sink, closing up and then the dry dock would be pumped out. Here's a picture of a steamer, wooden steamer in dry dock. So this activity continued right on up. Here's the tug Manistee, a wrecking tug, towing a barge. Probably headed for and you can see another, this is the stern gate of a dry dock. A little harbor tug, I think it's Jesse Winslow, I think, helping this vessel into a dry dock. And then this is a barge, SD Warren, being in the dry dock for repair. And again, this would be in the period 1920-ish, 1925. I was told by a fellow by the name of Ellsworth Lindsay, and I believe I have him on tape, because I was trying to interview some of these guys, the old timers, and he died, I believe, in the late 70s or 1979 or thereabouts. And he told me he thinks he was the last one to use the Wolverine dry dock, which was the last time any of the dry dock, and that was right after World War II in the 1940s. Ellsworth Lindsay had a fleet of tugs up on the Saginaw River, and he brought a couple of his tugs down to be worked on. And he told me, take it for what it is, that he thought he was the last person to ever use the dry dock. There's some famous vessels built in Port Huron for various reasons. One of these would be the Barkentine Robert Burns. Barkentine was, as you can see, this two-masted vessel was square-rigged, and this vessel was built in 1848 in Port Huron and lost in the Straits of Mackinac in 1869. This is the city of Port Huron, and this is an interesting vessel, having been built in Port Huron in 1867. Interesting in a couple of ways. If you can see these arch trusses, I'm going to show you a picture of a different ship, but very similar, Bay City. You see the arch truss, the side view of it. And this was because when they began to put the steamers usually were side wheelers. And only when somebody invented, a guy named Ericsson invented the screw propeller, did they begin to mount steam engines in the stern and use propellers. And so this would be an early version of that. But having all this weight, boiler and engine in the stern, caused vessels that weren't supported by some kind of an arch truss like this to hog. Just over the years, they begin to bend because of the weight of the engine and boiler. So when they built ships, they would build these arch trusses. And at first, they just built them, incorporating them into the hull. Later, they built them right into the hull, so you didn't see them, but they were there. But unless you were up real close, you wouldn't see it. Another thing about this little steam barge, and the term steam barge was used because they didn't dignify this kind of a steamboat with a propeller with the term steamer. That was reserved for the side wheelers. Of course, that later changed. But you could see this vessel could mount canvas if it needed to. A lot of the early captains didn't trust this newfangled steam engine thing. Another vessel that had kind of a dramatic end was that beautiful Homer Alverson that we saw just before launch, with all the people standing on the deck. It met its end. It was built in Port Huron in 1885 and met its end. It was driven ashore on Lake Michigan in 1898. Another one that somebody made comment about this was the Omar Conger. Again, built in Port Huron in 1882. She would dock. This is the passenger ferry. And you can see, here's the dock. This is the Military Street Bridge. This is looking north on Huron. And this is where its normal dock was. And it was at this location in 1922 when the boiler exploded. Now, there were some crew killed that were on the vessel, but fortunately there were no passengers. The passengers hadn't loaded yet. So pieces of the ship in the local paper said traveled two blocks and landed on a roof. It was quite the explosion, evidently. And I've seen after pictures, I don't have one with me, but of the rubble. You couldn't even tell it's a ship. It's just a lot of pieces of lumber. The Henry Steinbrenner, built by Jenks. It was built in Port Huron in 1901, again by Jenks, and it foundered with a loss of 17 crewmen on Lake Superior in 1953. And of course, the most famous, or shall we say infamous, vessel to be built in Port Huron was the steamer Eastland. The Eastland, which as we know was built in 1903 by Jenks, Eastland was a popular excursion boat, and it was in the Chicago River on the morning of July 24th, 1915, loading passengers, when it suddenly rolled over in the Chicago River. And of course, some of the passengers and crew were able to escape, but many, many were not. And so as they saved the people, rescued the people who were in the river, they then began the task of bringing up the bodies. Here you can see a woman's body being hauled up from the wreck. When all the bodies were recovered, the death toll turned out 835 people had lost their lives in the Eastland sinking, making it the worst marine disaster on Great Lakes history and making it one of the worst in world history. 835 people, men, women, and children. And in fact, here's a picture that says to me a whole lot. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words. This fireman's got this baby just recovered, the body of this baby. You see a Chicago cop in the background. Just the look in his eye, like, who is responsible for this? For a time, the press and, of course, these were employees of Western Electric Company in Chicago. They were going to have a picnic in Milwaukee, and so the families of these employees were all getting out of the boat for a July picnic in Milwaukee, and after the picnic, they'd be taken home. Well, it didn't. They never made it, and so you just see the look in his eyes, like, who's responsible for this disaster? And the captain was blamed, the chief engineer for not failing, or for failing to ballast the ship correctly, blamed, the finger of blame, looked at the naval architect who designed the vessel, looked at Jenks who built it. They were all in turn blamed. The captain was tried in Chicago and acquitted. So to this day, there's not really consensus as to what happened, but it was an accident, obviously. It was not ballasted right and sunk, or was it just top heavy based on its construction?
Is this the one there was some other event going on
Yep.
in the river and everybody ran to the
Yep, and but they're supposed to be able to accommodate that with ballasting.
The engineer was supposed to
Yes,
change the ballasting and they didn't
and
do it.
evidently didn't do it, or fasting, something. I mean, it was but people really wanted somebody to blame, and it never came out that way. The hull of the Eastland was later salvaged, and it was refitted and went back into the passenger trade, but its reputation was so tarnished as a death ship that it was unsuccessful. And so finally the owners sold the hull to the U.S. Navy, who converted it into a gunboat for use in training sailors from Great Lakes Naval Station on Lake Michigan. And it served without incident in that capacity all the way up till after World War II. It was scrapped. The hull of the Eastland, the gunboat, was scrapped in 1948. So hard to say whether it was bad design, whether it was bad ballasting, mistake. It was the gunboat Wilmette. And so we have really a very, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Toronto. There was a Jenks-built boat that used to be in Toronto as a restaurant, Captain John's. You may remember that. It, of course, was right on the water, and it was a nice restaurant. But that was a small boat that Jenks had built, too. Anyway, so, this activity of shipbuilding, repair, maintenance, ancillary services, sail making, et cetera, was big business for about 100 years in Port Huron and employed thousands of people. Today, very little left to even indicate it was that it went on. But there was a time when Port Huron was always ready. So that concludes my pitch. I hope you learned something and enjoyed it.
That's
Thank you. I don't know if you have any questions, but I'll be happy to do my best.
Yeah, did they put any coppers on the bottom of some of those old boats that along here?
No, not on saltwater they did. They sheathed them in copper, was common.
Paul, can you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, that's a good idea. The question was, did they sheathe any of these wooden vessels in copper, which is they commonly did on saltwater, but they did not do that in, to my knowledge, in the Great Lakes.
I had a question about the schooners, and they were trying to hitch a ride with the steamers to get up past the rapids. Before that, what would they do?
They originally, the early vessels, they actually towed them with oxen way back when. And then, of course, once they had tugboats and steamers, you know, a vessel could earn a few bucks by towing some schooners with it. And, you know, a tugboat, of course, that was its business, so.
Well, that's how that Reed made his money.
Yep. And, yeah, the Reed, you saw the one dry dock that was operated by Reed, the Reed Wrecking Company. Reed was a fascinating local guy. He and his father both, and they alternately lived in Port Huron and Sarnia, and they operated this wrecking business. There's a famous book written by a local woman, I think she's passed away, Mary Frances Donner, called, I believe it's called The Wrecker. And it's about, but she looks at it more from a family point of view and that. But she mentioned some of the technical difficulties this Reed faced in trying to salvage various shipwrecks, some of which he was successful and many of which he was not as well. Yep, I think he's buried in the Lakeside Cemetery. So,
Those photographs are amazing.
yeah, it's nice. And some people have made them available to me to copy. And when I worked at the college, they enjoyed me getting out and giving talks. So they thought it was good publicity for the college. So they would use, I could use their photo equipment, or I didn't even have to do it. I could assign it and they would have a clerk do it. So.
In the earliest days, you described the material for the mast and for the ribbing, et cetera, but what about the keel plate? And how did they get that in?
That was white oak,
White
the
oak.
keel. And, yeah, and most of them, they were centerboard schooners, meaning that the keel would fold up into the ship, could be cranked up into the ship. And so you, in addition to having the sides of the ship and the bottom of the hull, you had to have a place for the keel to go that wouldn't allow water in. So sometimes you see that I know on shipwrecks I've seen it a lot.
Is there anything written, any books or anything on, actually these guys and the route in harvesting the lumber? Because that guy had to determine each tree that was cut, where he was going to use it in that boat and lay it out. But he had to pick that skill up from someplace besides England, Port Huron.
Yeah, the question is, did a shipwright, who picked out the lumber, and the ship's carpenter, in many cases while it was standing for at least some of the parts of the ship, how did they get that skill? And I don't know. There is a book, it's more like a big pamphlet, called The Wooden Shipbuilding Era on the Great Lakes by a Captain Inchins, I may have that pronounced wrong, and that talks a lot about, not necessarily in Port Huron, but wooden shipbuilding. And some of the slides I actually got from that book. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you all for coming and welcome you to the future activities. When's the next one? I believe 2 weeks, like the 30th, I think.
Yeah, so the mini lecture series are coming up on Sundays from 2 to 3, and the next one is on September 30th. That is Ship Signals with Chris Faber. Then Sunday, October 14th, Ship Photography with Robert Campbell, and Sunday, October 28th, Disasters on the Great Lakes, just in time for Halloween. So,
And you all know Margaret Akins. She's the director of the Port Huron Museum, which operates this location as well.
so thank you so much
Thank you
for
very-
the lecture. It was informative and super interesting. I didn't know any of this, even though I was born and raised in in Port Huron. So
Well, there's very little of it left.
yeah, it's fascinating. But we have a special gift for you over at the gift
Oh,
shop.
okay, thank
so,
you.
you all are welcome to join us at the gift shop, and we hope to see you again.
Okay.